Please be quiet and let the educated people speak. The words, cold and condescending, cut through the morning sight, meeting like a blade, striking directly at a man's dignity. Silence fell. All heads turned. At the center of those stairs stood Marcus Bell, a black bricklayer in a faded work shirt, hands still smudged with mortar and dust. He said nothing, didn't flinch, but his eyes, calm in a way that was almost unsettling, locked directly onto the man who had just insulted him. That man was Ethan Caldwell, chief engineer, Stanford graduate, Italian shoes, and a constant air of icy authority. He was known for one thing, above all, his habit of looking down on anyone without a degree. But Ethan didn't know one crucial fact. The man he had just humiliated wasn't just a worker, and his arrogance just a few hours later would become a bitter pill he'd be forced to swallow. This is a true story, and it begins with a sentence that seemed harmless, yet shook an entire company to its core. Please be quiet and let the educated people speak. The words cut through the air like a knife, silencing the morning meeting at the construction site. Every eye, from engineers to laborers, turned toward one man, Marcus Bell, a black man in a faded work shirt, hands still dusted with mortar, standing quietly amid a circle of stunned and confused stares. The one who spoke was Ethan Caldwell, the project's new chief engineer, Stanford graduate, Italian shoes, always wearing a blazer despite the dust-covered site. Since joining Bellamy Structures, Ethan had built a reputation not for his skills, but for his cold arrogance and blatant habit of belittling others. Marcus, 42 years old, nearly half his life spent on construction sites, was not someone easily offended. He'd endured his share of prejudice and condescension, but this time was different. In front of nearly 40 people, he wasn't just cut off while raising a legitimate technical concern. He was insulted in the very trade he had dedicated his life to. We don't pay bricklayers to think, just follow orders. At that moment, all he had done was point out a serious oversight. The northeast section had a natural ground slope, which if left unaddressed, would put uneven pressure on the foundation and could lead to future cracks or structural failure. But Ethan laughed loudly, mocking him in front of everyone. A bricklayer doing structural analysis. Now, maybe we should give you an engineering license. A few engineers chuckled awkwardly, not because it was funny, but because they didn't dare oppose him. Some workers looked down. The silence grew heavy like wet concrete, setting in place. Marcus stood there, surprisingly calm. He didn't argue. He said nothing more, but there was no submission in his eyes, only a strange, quiet composure, as if he were watching a man dig his own grave without realizing it. Understood, sir. I just thought it needed to be said, he replied quietly, then carefully slid his notebook back into his pocket. No one in that room knew that in that very moment of public humiliation, Marcus Bell, the bricklayer they all assumed was just another ordinary worker, had just set in motion a chain of events that would flip the entire power dynamic of this construction site. No one noticed Marcus leaving the meeting room earlier than usual. No one paid attention to the way he walked, not angry, not rushed, as if everything had already been part of the plan. While Ethan went on and on about the construction schedule, pointing at charts on his expensive tablet, Marcus sat quietly in the far corner, tapping out a few lines on his scratched old phone. An hour later, the meeting ended. The engineers and managers began to scatter, getting ready to return to work until Ethan's phone rang. He glanced at the screen and froze. His eyes narrowed with tension. Emergency, meeting with the company chairman in 15 minutes. He repeated aloud just enough for everyone to hear. His voice, now tinged with confusion, had lost its earlier arrogance. The name Daniel Bellamy wasn't one people heard often. In fact, he was a shadowy figure in the construction industry, rarely seen outside headquarters and almost never at a job site. A sudden meeting request from him was never a good sign. Ethan's tone shifted instantly. He ordered the area cleaned up, barked instructions to wipe down tables, straighten drawings as if a fresh coat of polish could hide technical flaws. Tension spread through the command center. Whispers began a design flaw, delays a complaint. No one noticed. Marcus quietly leaving the meeting area, heading toward the parking lot at the edge of the site. His faded sedan was parked behind the row of shiny SUVs belonging to the managers. He opened the trunk and pulled out a crisp white shirt, freshly ironed, and changed right there behind the car door. Then came a sleek brown leather briefcase neatly trimmed and a pair of thin-framed glasses he carefully slid on. Within minutes, the mortar-dusted worker from the morning had vanished. In his place stood a sharply dressed man, features focused eyes, calm but heavy with intent. He took a deep breath. Then he walked, not like a laborer heading home, but like a man returning to reclaim his voice. A sleek black Mercedes rolled slowly through the main gate of the construction site, its mere presence enough to silence the entire area. People stopped in their tracks. A few managers adjusted their collars. Ethan straightened his tie and stood tall, taking on the posture of a commander welcoming a superior. Everyone thought they were about to meet Daniel Bellamy, the elusive founder of Bellamy Structures, a man who avoided cameras, the media, and unannounced site visits. The front door opened. First, a bodyguard stepped out, eyes scanning the area with quiet authority. Then the rear door swung open. Out stepped a middle-aged black man dressed in a sharp gray suit, a plain black tie, and wearing an expression of quiet command and experience. Every eye locked on him. Ethan stepped forward, hand extended, a forced smile stretched across his face. "Welcome, Mr. Bellamy. It's an honor to have you here. We're right on schedule." The man stopped in front of Ethan but did not take his hand. "I'm Daniel Marcus, Bellamy chairman and founder of Bellamy Structures." The words dropped like thunder on a clear day. Ethan froze, his face stiffening. He stammered, "I'm sorry. We were expecting Mr. Daniel Bellamy." "That's me, and I'm also the bricklayer you humiliated in front of the entire crew this morning." A wave of silence washed over the faces of those watching. Eyes widened. A few people instinctively took a step back, Ethan's face drained of color, his mouth open, searching for an explanation that wouldn't come. "I kept my identity hidden for a reason." Daniel continued, his voice calm but firm. "I wanted to see firsthand how this site is run when no one's watching, and more importantly, how people treat each other when they believe no one is watching." In the distance, workers began to gather, whispering. Many now recognized the suit draped over the same man they had shared lunch with just a day before. The one they thought was just another laborer was in fact the founder of the very empire they worked for. Ethan stood like a statue. The arrogance he had worn so confidently had evaporated, leaving only a dry, hollow panic. "If you had simply listened to a bricklayer, as you called me," Daniel said softly, almost in a whisper, "you might have impressed your own chairman. Instead..." He let the sentence hang, but his eyes said the rest. Arrogance had just dug its own grave. The atmosphere inside the control center was thick, like unset concrete. No one dared move, all eyes on Daniel Bellamy, the man who just hours earlier had been Marcus, the new bricklayer, now standing tall with the presence of a true leader. "All engineers and managers." Daniel turned to his assistant. "Emergency meeting in the main operations room in 15 minutes. Bring all design documents, budget reports, and technical decisions made in the last 3 months." No one argued. Ethan nodded like a robot. Sweat began to bead on his forehead despite the air conditioning. 15 minutes later, in a glass-walled meeting room overlooking the construction site, the division was clear. On one side sat Daniel Bellamy alongside veteran site commander Walter Grant and 2 technical auditors. On the other, Ethan and his engineering team, silent and pale. "I'll get straight to the point," Daniel began. "Why was a foundation warning in the northeast sector not only ignored, but the person who raised it publicly humiliated?" Ethan cleared his throat, trying to regain composure. "Sir, I believe it was just a misunderstanding, an issue of communication. I merely wanted to emphasize the importance of the engineering role within the hierarchy." "Hierarchy?" Daniel interrupted, eyes fixed on the tablet in his hand. "Bellamy Structures. Employee Handbook, page 27, states all staff, regardless of position, are obligated to report potential structural risks." A light tap audio played across the room. Ethan's voice recorded that very morning. "We work with calculations, not the gut feelings of a bricklayer who can't even use a measuring tape properly." Ethan looked down. There was nothing left to defend, but Daniel wasn't finished. "In the past 2 hours, my audit team has reviewed every technical decision you signed off on." One of the auditors stood up holding a report. "We found 17 technical violations, the most severe unauthorized material changes. Foundation sample reports were also falsified." Ethan whispered, I can explain." Before he could say more, another engineer stood abruptly. "Mr. Bellamy, we actually raised the Northeast issue several times." But Ethan insisted the calculations were fine and said cutting corners was necessary. To meet the bonus target at the end of the project, Daniel raised an eyebrow. "For a bonus," another voice admitted quietly. "If we saved over $1 million, the whole team would get a share." Ethan was speechless now. He collapsed into his chair, pale and hollow, like a man watching himself crumble atop a foundation he once claimed was solid. "One last thing," Daniel said firmly. "You have two options. One, termination with cause, plus legal proceedings for misconduct and document falsification. Your license may be revoked." Ethan swallowed hard. His legs trembled slightly. "Two, resign voluntarily. Return all received bonuses and spend 6 months teaching for free in our vocational program for underprivileged youth." Daniel looked him straight in the eye. "You have 5 minutes to decide. In the meantime, I'll go speak to the workers. They deserve to know what's really been happening on the site. They pour their sweat into every day." As Daniel Bellamy stepped out of the meeting room, the entire site seemed to hold its breath. From scaffolding to foundation pits to the worker housing area, all eyes followed the man who just that morning was Marcus the Quiet Bricklayer. He didn't need a microphone. His presence alone commanded silence. Daniel stood on a wooden platform, looking down at the people who were building a dream of concrete and steel. A soft breeze carried dust through the fading sunlight. "I know many of you had lunch with me thinking I was just another worker among hundreds, and you were right, I was part of this team. I am Daniel Marcus Bellamy, founder of Bellamy Structures, and also the bricklayer who was insulted this morning by a senior engineer in front of this entire site." Silence. A few murmurs, but most stood frozen, stunned. Some exchanged glances, surprised, but somehow relieved. "I didn't disguise myself to test anyone. I did it because I believe a company is only truly strong when its leader understands every brick, every drop of sweat laid down for it. And sometimes the only way to see clearly is to live as the people who build it." He paused for a few seconds, scanning sunburned, dirt-streaked but honest faces. "I have two announcements. First engineer Ethan Caldwell will no longer be working at Bellamy Structures, effective immediately." A brief silence, then spontaneous applause erupted. It wasn't celebration over someone's downfall, but agreement with justice. Daniel raised his hand, signaling for quiet. "The second announcement is more important. Starting today, I want you to remember this. Whether you have a PhD or never finished school, your voice matters. The safety and quality of this site depend not on titles printed on business cards, but on ears willing to listen." At that moment, the meeting room door opened. Ethan stepped out, carrying a box of personal belongings. No longer a man of power, he looked unusually small. His eyes avoided contact. His shoulders slumped. There were no jeers, no smug laughter, just a silent hallway left for him to walk through, lined with the hardest look to bear pity. Just before getting into the car, Ethan's eyes met Daniel's. They held each other's gaze. No anger, no smile, just a faint nod, as if one man had finally understood the difference between power and respect. Walter Grant, the longtime commander who had stood by Daniel since the early days, walked over. Which option did he choose? Daniel looked toward the vehicle, disappearing behind the site's gate. Voluntary, he'll teach 6 months in the vocational training program. Walter nodded slowly, part surprised, part satisfied. "You've always had a way of seeing past appearances. Daniel, maybe that's how you built an empire, with the same hands that once laid brick and mortar." Daniel said nothing. He simply turned to face the rising structure behind them, steel and concrete taking shape in the golden dusk. But in his eyes, something deeper was being built today, a new foundation, one made of respect and fairness. As the crowd of workers slowly drifted back to their stations, the atmosphere hadn't fully returned to normal. Something had shifted, not visible, but unmistakably felt. A quiet energy, as if the entire site had been rebuilt on a new kind of foundation, not made of concrete, but of something intangible. Trust. Daniel Bellamy lingered a moment longer, watching silently. He didn't rush to leave. He knew this moment mattered more than any blueprint in the operations office, because the project he was building now wasn't on paper. It was taking shape in the minds and hearts of the hundreds who labored for it. Walter walked up beside him and asked softly, "Do you want me to reschedule the management meeting this afternoon?" Daniel shook his head. "No need. I want to meet with everyone." 10 minutes later, the entire workforce, engineers, laborers, forklift, drivers, safety supervisors had gathered in front of the main operations area. No microphones, no podium. Just a man in a gray shirt standing in the middle of the crowd, and yet every eye was on him. I used to think I understood this company because I founded it, but I realized you only truly know a place when you've lived as the lowest person in its system. Daniel paused. His eyes scanned the faces of those who had hauled cement bags with him, dug foundations beside him. "I didn't go undercover to test you. I did it to test myself, to see if I still had the courage to listen, to understand, and to learn from the ground up." A few heads nodded, eyes lit up, not with surprise, but with something deeper recognition, like they had finally seen what they'd quietly hoped for: a boss who listens. Today, an engineer was dismissed, not because of a technical error, we all make mistakes, but because he dismissed others' voices, because he believed his title gave him the right to silence others. Daniel stepped forward. His voice dropped, but it carried weight. From this point on at Bellamy Structures, every voice matters. Whether you studied at MIT or learned on the job, whether you carry a laptop or a trowel, if you see something wrong, you have the right and the responsibility to speak up. Applause broke out. No one had to prompt it. It wasn't for someone's firing. It was for something far more powerful, the realization that they were finally being heard. Daniel smiled faintly. He knew this moment wouldn't just change a job site, it would reshape the culture of an entire company, a culture where people dared to speak, dared to listen, and dared to make things right. 6 months had passed since that day the construction site shook, not from concrete or machinery, but from the collapse of something far more fragile: pride. The Bellamy Structures skyscraper was now complete, standing firm on the very foundation that had been reinforced after Marcus, or rather Daniel. Marcus Bellamy was mocked for daring to raise a warning. On the 30th floor, where glass walls reflected the vast skyline, Daniel sat in the executive boardroom with his senior leadership team. Much had changed, more than steel or glass could show. At the head of the table, Walter Grant, his longtime friend and collaborator, was now the Chief Executive Officer. On screen, he presented results from the Field Talent Integration Initiative launched in the aftermath of the Ethan Caldwell incident. Safety reports are up 78%. Communication now flows freely across all levels. The most capable workers, regardless of where they stand, are being identified and trained. Daniel nodded. His expression wasn't just satisfied, it was proud. "And the volunteer program?" he asked. Though the answer had long lived in his heart, Walter smiled and clicked to the next slide. The screen lit up with a photo, a group of young people diverse in every way, studying construction techniques. At the center, a familiar man held a pen pointing at a blueprint. No crisp white shirt, no expensive tie, no slicked back hair or executive swagger. But the eyes were different, calmer, deeper. Richard Ethan Caldwell. Walter said, "Volunteer instructor month 6, trained 52 students, job placement rate 94%, and surprisingly, he's requested to extend for another term." A brief silence filled the room. Daniel exhaled, not in surprise, but with a feeling hard to name, a victory that needed no applause. After the meeting, Daniel headed down to the ground floor, where the company's new training center now stood within the campus. He saw Richard mid-lecture, explaining load-bearing principles with a patience no one had seen from him before. Their eyes met. Richard nodded, not to greet a boss, but to acknowledge a truth: "I was wrong, and I'm making it right." Later in the parking lot, Daniel found Richard packing tools into a worn sedan, the same man who once drove a polished sports car. They stood face to face, no ranks, no barriers. "You doing okay?" Daniel asked. Richard nodded, glancing toward the newly completed tower. "At first, I thought this was a punishment," he admitted. 6 months teaching kids the world used to overlook. But then, I discovered something Stanford never taught me in 10 years of lecturing." He paused, looking Daniel in the eye. "They learn fast. They ask questions I never saw coming. They find answers outside the formulas." Daniel smiled faintly. When we stop judging people by the surface, we start seeing the remarkable. Richard bowed his head. I realized the lesson on the first day, but it took 6 months to see it wasn't a lesson. It was a second chance. Daniel asked quietly, "Will you return to the industry?" Richard shook his head. "I've turned down a few offers. Honestly, I've asked to stay another semester. There are students I'm not ready to walk away from." Daniel nodded. He said nothing more. He simply placed a hand on Richard's shoulder and gave it a firm squeeze, their first true handshake. Not one of titles, but of respect. The next morning, sunlight poured into the grand lobby of Bellamy Tower, the city's newest architectural landmark. Amid the sleek, modern space stood a bronze plaque, proudly mounted on the central wall. Etched into it were simple words, free of decoration, but heavy as steel. "We build structures with materials, but we build respect with humility. No signature, no author's name." Because for those who knew the story, this wasn't a slogan, it was a legacy. From high above, Daniel Bellamy looked down at the next construction site, an upcoming project already in motion. He saw engineers and laborers huddled together discussing side by side, no clear divide between dress shirts and dusty overalls. They were asking, listening, deciding together a simple scene. But in the world of construction, it was nothing short of a quiet revolution. To Daniel, it was proof that everything he had endured, the humiliation, the disguise, the anger, had not been in vain. It was the foundation of a new culture. One where people weren't judged by their skin, their job title, or their background, but by their spirit, their skills, and their humanity. In the distance, the vocational training center was still alive with activity. Inside, Richard Caldwell stood at the chalkboard sketching diagrams with a sense of purpose, as if every white line was part of a new structure. Not one that stood on land, but one being built within hearts. He was no longer a senior engineer with a towering ego. He was now a guide, relearning how to build this time on a foundation of respect. Daniel knew this wasn't the end. It was the first chapter of a new kind of leadership, a model other construction giants were already studying and emulating. He stepped out of his office and blended into the elevator crowd like any other employee, because he understood respect doesn't come from where you stand, it comes from how you stand beside others. As he made his way to the parking lot, a young employee nervously approached him. "Mr. Bellamy, I'm just a new hire, but if I think there's something off in the elevator shaft design, can I bring it up?" Daniel looked at the young man, smiled, and nodded. "Not only can you should. That's exactly what I hope you'll do. This story doesn't end with tall walls or deep foundations. It ends, or perhaps begins again, in a place long overlooked, listening, acknowledging, changing. And above all, one truth as solid as concrete. Titles can give orders, but only humility earns respect." And so a story that began with an insult ended in transformation, not just of a person, but of an entire system. An arrogant engineer learned how to bow his head. A silent owner learned how to speak up at the right moment. And hundreds of others learned that in this world, a person's worth isn't defined by title or degree, but by how we treat each other when no one's watching. No one is born a leader. Leadership is forged in the small moments when we choose to listen instead of dictate, choose respect over judgment. Because in the end, any structure can be built with concrete and steel, but a healthy culture can only be built with kindness and humility. As an expert in organizational management, I can confidently say the most successful companies aren't those where the smartest people give orders, but where everyone at every level is allowed to have a voice,